But let's talk about Japan and Korea. As Scott and Michael mentioned before, they're both fairly similar markets in terms of the way we categorise them. They're very different culturally, of course, but they both are very mature markets for Australian beef. They're both very large markets for Australian beef. So I'm just going to do both in a row. So I'll talk about Japan for about 15 and I'll talk about Korea for about 15. And then I think we'll have some questions after Europe's presentation. And I'll just talk, the same structure for both presentations. We'll talk about the market itself and what's driving that market. We'll talk about what opportunities exist in that market, so what's happening with consumers, etc., in Japan and Korea. And then we'll talk about our strategy. So what does MLA do in Japan and Korea to try and grow sales for Australian beef? So Japan's a really interesting place from a food imports perspective. It's a very small country. It's the 61st biggest country in the world. But it's a highly populous nation. So most of the country is actually mountainous and pretty much uninhabitable. But they still have the 10th biggest population crammed into the lowlands. And it's the number 3 global economy, so it's an economic powerhouse. And then most importantly, because they don't have much agricultural land, they're a major importer of food. And in fact, most people would probably think that China would be the number 1 protein importer in the world, but it's actually Japan. Japan's the number 1 protein importer in the world. Probably not for long, but currently they're the largest importer, 3.2 million metric tonnes of meat. And in terms of market size, Japan's always been a major market for many years. It's a stable and large market for Australian beef. It takes around 30% of our beef, but importantly, it's certainly overactive in the more customer-facing types of beef. So 43% of our chilled beef ends up in Japan and 52% of our grain-fed beef. And it's certainly more likely to be a market where you can see Australian beef identified on shelves and on menus, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And let's just look at the trends. I mean, I said it was a large and stable market, but it's not, like any of our international markets, it's not without its upheavals. You'll see some shocks in this graph here, which is our exports to Japan. The main one's 2002 and 3, and that was because of BSE. So we never had BSE, of course, but the Japanese did and the Americans did, and that led to a crash in beef consumption in Japan. But then there was obviously a huge escalation as confidence recovered, particularly around Australian beef, in its safety, and we became basically the only importer of beef into that country. So there were some very big years. From around 2007, you'll start to see that decline, and that's because the US started making a staged re-entry to the market. That staged re-entry took a long time, and they're still not fully back in without restrictions, but the restrictions that they have don't have much impact on the ability of the US to trade into Japan. So effectively, since 2013-14, it's been a level playing field, and you can see that we've then stabilised our business in Japan. And just to mention that competition, Scott mentioned before the forecast for increased US beef production. Well, Japan's the US beef's biggest export market as well as us. And so, and before BSE, they were the market share leader in Japan. So they're actively trying to regain that position. And you can see, based mostly on their supplies, you can see that year on year they're really getting more beef into that market. So I think the interesting thing is that they haven't taken it from us. They've actually been involved in growing total beef consumption in Japan. So that's the positive, really, is that total imports are growing, but because of the American prices and the American supply right now, they've been able to take more of that market share. And just to focus a little bit on competition for a second, the reason I focus on competition, it's important because, let's make sure this is the pointer, yep. So that top left picture you've got there, that's actually Australian beef and US beef in the same tray pack at a supermarket. So that's a very sort of unique example, which I don't think will take off, but we do often find Australian beef and US beef as the same cut, same spec, sitting next to each other at retailers, and consumers are making the choice. So it's a bit like the old Coke Pepsi thing. Consumers are actively making a decision between beef from Australia and beef from the United States. And in terms of their marketing, they're set up in a fairly similar fashion to Australian beef promotion. They've got an office in Tokyo, and they've got nationwide marketing programs around this American beef with a number of activities designed to grow their market share. So just to sum on the market, it really is a vital market for Australian beef, given its high volume and the range of cuts it takes, etc. And it is facing fierce competition. So, but the market is not without its great opportunities. So the next section I'll just quickly cover a couple of the opportunities that we see in the market. Andrew McPherson's here, and he's sitting on the next panel. Hopefully he'll be able to talk about some of the opportunities he sees in Japan, Korea. But from the country of origin promotion angle, there's a couple of great things that we can see in market from our consumer insights. The first one is the country of origin. So I used to work in domestic marketing, and we do a lot of surveys about how people shop and what they're looking for. And the two things that people mostly in the cities were telling us in Australia in terms of what they're looking for might surprise you, but one of them is how springy the meat is. So when you poke the meat, how quickly does it recover and bounce back? And the second one was how bright coloured the meat is. They're the two things that people without a whole lot of knowledge about what they're buying, that was the two sort of things that they used, obviously aside from price and the use by date and all that sort of thing, pack size. But not many Australians tell you that country of origin is their key driver, of course, because they're used to all the beef being Australian. But in places like Japan, and you'll see in Korea, country of origin is actually the number one driver. The reason for that is they import so much of their food and they've had some food scares from other markets, other importers, that they're very nervous about where the food that they buy comes from. So it's actually the number one decision driver for meat at retail. And the really good news is, and you see this with Japan and Korea, is that when we ask consumers what they think of the two major country of origins for beef in Japan, we tend to have a much stronger consumer affinity. So the brand that Jacob was talking about, people have a stronger connection with Australian beef than our competitor. So such important drivers like consistent quality standards, my family's favourite, and guaranteed safe to eat. In fact, out of all the measures that we ask in the survey, the only one which US has a higher score on is cheaper. And of course, as Jacob also mentioned, being the cheapest in consumers' minds and hearts isn't necessarily the best place to be. It'll grow your market share because people shop with their wallets, but over the long term, we'd be confident that with these fantastic consumer perceptions, that we're in a good position. And there's a couple other trends, something's missing from that slide, but a couple other trends that are in our favour that are driving future sales. One of them is the steak boom. So in Japan, the last 5 years has been a magnificent increase in steakhouses, in consumers cooking and buying and cooking steaks for the home. And there's also been a big increase in health awareness. So consumers in Japan, you all know they have that very high grade Wagyu, which they call white beef. But a lot more consumers are interested in eating leaner beef, which they call red meat, or akami niku, which all Australian beef really fits into. So a big increase in awareness and interest in roast beef and larger pieces because of the iron content and that kind of thing. And then trade dynamic was touched upon before. We have a free trade agreement, or what we call economic partnership agreement with Japan, which means our tariff is lower than our American friends. And we've also just signed up to the TPP deal with 11 nations, one that Donald Trump decided to pull out of. So that will see our tariffs, if it comes into this year, hopefully, that will see our tariff situation improve even further in Japan. So despite that competition I mentioned, in our view, we see a lot of opportunities abounding in Japan, which is why, even though it's a big, stable market, we have put it into the grow category to make sure that we're actively pursuing those opportunities. Okay, so just the last bit is what are we doing in the market? So there's 8 of us over there, 7 Japanese nationals and myself, and we work with the major accounts mostly, so those major buyers of Australian beef. So fundamentally what we do strategically is we work with the end users of Australian beef to grow sales together. And on this page here you can see a lot of logos of some of those major accounts that we work with. You'll recognise some like McDonald's, but most of the others are Japanese-owned companies. And with those accounts, we're trying to run and activate regular promotional activity. So we want the Australian beef brand to be very prominent at retail. We know that Japanese consumers are actively looking for Australian beef, so we need it to be easily identifiable so that consumers can shortcut the process at the supermarket and grab that beef that they're looking for. So we run regular promotional activity, retail and food service. And also we have strong relationships with the trade. The exporters in the room would know that Japan, even with its large scale and sheer size, it still is generally run by about 10 to 15 companies in the trade. The old men in black suits, I call them, these guys in this photo. So we need MLA's role with the trade over there is really to be a good source of information. So we distribute information about our supply, the things that Scott's working on. We make sure that the trade's aware of what's coming in terms of supply and some of those fundamental industry systems. One of those is shelf life. So just as an example of what we do, we always highlight our systematic advantages. So many of you will be wondering how those industry systems get described overseas. Well, you don't put them on a pack, but you're always talking about some of these advantages. So what you see here in the green is our shelf life recommendations for chilled beef in Japan. They're very conservative, so it's at 77 days. Other markets have over 100. But the fact is, while albeit conservative, they've given us a lot more shelf life than American beef or even their own local beef. That has a real meaning for customers because when they're using Australian beef, they've got more time to get it through their supply chain. They've got more faith really in its ability to hold up over that 77 days. Whereas they can have a problem with other products which doesn't perform as consistently over time. There we are. So lastly with Japan, I just want to focus on a couple of case studies. So firstly, our major campaign in Japan is activated in spring and summer. The reason for that, as you can see on this page here, is that graph is US strip loin prices over a 5-year time frame. And what you can see is that every spring in Northern Hemisphere, US prices shoot right up and they don't come back down till the end of summer or halfway through summer. The reason for that is Americans all switch on their barbecues in March, April for grilling beef when the weather warms up. And that massive domestic market just starts hogging their supplies. So there's an opportunity in Japan, which is our biggest loin export market, to promote steaks and barbecues in this time. And over the long term, we aim to associate spring and summer with Aussie beef barbecues. So on this slide here, you can see just a couple of photos from a recent activity we did in Tokyo. If anyone's been to Tokyo, this is in Omotesando, which is a fashionable district where a lot of new trends come out. So last year we set up a pop-up store on the main street there where consumers could come in. It was set up a bit like an experience of Australian beef, so there was people demonstrating how to cook. They could buy a cup with some diced steak in it and some other ingredients, really tasty actually, to eat with chopsticks, which is how they prefer. Or they could actually buy a single steak to take home with some instructions on it. So that was a really successful promotion. I'm not going to tell you about it because I think we've got a video that we can play on the off chance it works. Here we go.
期間限定の店をオープンしました。 このお店は今月18日までの限定で東京港区に設けられました。
赤身の牛肉が美味しく味わえるとされる厚切りの牛肉が売り出されました。
夏のお楽しみといえばバーベキュー。6月6日、表参道にオージービーフのダブル厚ステーキが体験できるポップアップストアが登場しました。
ゼロベース表参道からレッツバービー。
マターファミリーの花火です。上田のグランフロント大阪で行われたオージービーフの PR イベントにやってきました。ジューシーなお肉を満喫です。
オーストラリア産の牛肉を PR するため生産者団体がイベントを開きました。
体験型オージービーフでレッツバービーポップアップイベントが開催中です。
いいですね。
So I apologise for the Pitt Street farmer that you saw scattered through that video. That my staff assure me that I need to look someone like Crocodile Dundee when I'm advertising Australian beef over there. So they've got me in a Cooper and I'm not allowed to leave the house without it when we're doing these press events. And then the last bit I'll talk about, apart from the advertising bit, we're also working really hard. I think someone mentioned at one of the other speakers on some areas where we associate Australian beef with the concept of Genki, which is healthy, full of life. And a good way to do that is with kids, of course. So there's no better way to associate or build an identity for a brand than associate with that nation's children, because that's the way into the families, of course. So we're supporting some barbecues and some other promotional material at elementary school rugby events we started last year. We got some Wallabies down when they played Japan, and we just helped support an event which had schools from all around Japan. So we're looking at other opportunities to do that sort of more grassroots, especially the Rugby World Cup's coming up, but other opportunities like surfing, surf lifesaving, sports that have an association with Australia where we can get the kids, out and about and get them with an Aussie beef steak and demonstrate how Australian beef can make their kids healthy and strong. So that's one of the other programs I just thought I'd mention. So we have a program that we've built around those consumer and trade insights, and we're aiming to deliver against those a strategy which is against those consumer and trade insights. So let's just sum up on Japan, then we'll move on before I get the wind up from Brad there. It's a vital market with fierce competition, and the US does have a big increase in supply coming, so it's certainly a place where we're under that competitive threat. However, there are some opportunities that abound in Japan for Australian beef, which we're looking to capture, and we've built a program that aims to deliver against those consumer and trade insights.